Good day, and welcome to all of the friends of Phorum who are joining us for this conversation. I'm Peter Coffey, Vice President for Strategic Research at Salesforce, and I'm joined today by Michael Chui, a partner at McKinsey & Company and McKinsey Global Institute. Michael, we have been so fortunate to have McKinsey's interest in this year's forum. We hoped to have you, live on stage with us, and I'm so pleased that we were able to get this instead. And in particular, when I found out some of the things that you've been sharing in the space of this year's forum conversation, we've chosen the tagline Beyond Automation this year. And each of those words has such a resonance right now because there are so many people who are trying to define success right now with a phrase of back to the office, back to doing traditional in-person kinds of interactions. And we don't want to go back to, we want to take advantage, I think, of the pandemic's acceleration and elevation of what people now know they can have, but then also this word automation, because for so long, automation was considered an absolutely progressive kind of term. But as I've observed in other contexts, automation is when you're very happy with what you're doing and you want to do it repeatedly, identically, assuming perfect quality of information, assuming predictability of environment and so on. And so both the word beyond and the word automation are, I think now today, challenges rather than goals to some degree. And I wonder what your thoughts are on automation versus other words we hear, in particular augmentation, which rather than replacing people is a matter of amplifying what people do well. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, first of all, Peter, thanks for having and the rest of the forum organizers. Thanks for having me on. I was actually born in Philadelphia, so I wish I could be there in person. Thank you. But again, I'm delighted and honored to be able to join you virtually. It is funny. I mean, I think there is a little bit of a nowadays augmentation sounds better than automation. I do want to say, to me, oftentimes it's just a matter of the lens, right? So I'm going to, come at this in just a couple of ways, just to talk about a little bit how we've thought about it in our research at the McKinsey Global Institute. But certainly, look, you could, if you think about, a sort of traditional factory and assembly line, and you put a robot in there, from the worker's perspective, their labor was replaced by capital and automation occurred. On the other hand, to the plant manager, they're able to do more with less, and to them it was a sense of augmentation. And so there's always that lens. But I think more importantly is the other insight that we discovered as we looked at across every occupation in the economy and all the constituent activities within those occupations. BLS describes 20 to 30 detailed work activities in their taxonomy. And what we discovered is in many cases, the maybe scary statistic or opportunity is about 50% of the time we pay people to be at work. That activity is potentially automatable without even some kind of technology breakthrough. Now, it does require integration of constituent technologies, but that's possible. But the other interesting thing is it's actually not true. That means 50% of jobs are 100% automatable. Actually, what we discover is we're all doing something which potentially pieces of it could be automated, in which case it feels like augmentation because my job changes. The machine does some stuff, Excel, right? For we who are knowledge workers. And, there used to be a time when someone would, go to the adding machine, do all that. That work was automated, but many of those jobs, those occupations still exist. And I think that's more likely to be what happens. Automation occurs, but when automation occurs as a portion of somebody's occupation, it's actually a form of augmentation. And so to a certain extent, again, these things are different lenses on what might be possible. With that said, there's another trope. I sometimes enjoy the Mythbuster thing. I don't know if the show's still on the air, but nevertheless, the guys, our San Francisco Bay Area folks, where I happen to live now. And, I've heard this thing, in 10 years, 60% of the occupations will be things you've never heard of before. And as far as I can tell, we can't really find much evidence of where that came from other than a brainstorming that was done by an institution in Palo Alto, California, hosted by one. When we look at the actual amount of new occupations that are created, and my goodness, there are, right? You have professional video game players, for instance, but nevertheless, it's more in the range of 0.5% of all occupations per year.
Mm.
And so that doesn't add up to 60% within 10 years or even 20 years. But nevertheless, sure, we do in fact have new occupations coming. But mostly what we have is the same occupations where people will have to be androids and work together with machines.
That has been such a key idea, is that the first generation of automation excluded and replaced people. Robots that had to be placed in a safety cage, because if you were in the way and the robot's arm was moving, it wasn't going to care. It was going to go right through you and break your head if your head was in the way. And then we had some work that was done on building robots that could work safely around people, that would be aware of the presence of a softer object like a human body around and not just do what they did. So this idea of building automations that are compatible with a human collaborator instead of threatening in many ways, whether threatening livelihood or actually threatening physical safety of a human collaborator. I think I understand you to say that that's now something that we can anticipate receiving more attention and investment as we go forward.
I do think that we're going to continue to see that, and as you're alluding to, these cobots or collaboration robots in physical realm, but also continuing innovation in the realm of knowledge work and the things that, again, yep, we can work, quote, side by side with machines.
Well, one of the things that to your point about the jobs don't go away, but a worker with a spreadsheet compared to a worker with a 4-function calculator, I think one of the things we see is that there's going to be the capability and very soon the expectation that you won't find a solution, that you will have explored an envelope of solutions. I mean, we even get to the point where things like quantum computing hardware, which are now just about crossing the threshold from we might be able to do this to, well, now it's how soon and how big and how cheap, not if at all. The idea that now, and I've seen this being done already in areas like logistics, where something that used to take 25 hours to do can now be done in 20 minutes. And doing it in 20 minutes is much more worthwhile if what you want is a 24-hour forecast. The 25 hours to do a 24-hour forecast, well, that was a stupid technology trick. But if you can run it in 25 seconds, and now you can explore 20 or 30 different possibilities and optimize instead of just being happy that you found a solution. Is that something that you're seeing as something that more knowledge work jobs are going to move from, did you perform the procedure, to your point, something that is automatable, to did you explore a variety of options and apply a combination of intuition and more rigorous algorithms to find best solutions?
I think that's exactly what we're going to see. And, it's funny, as you were talking about the planning cycle, as a client serving consultant, I served a client whose annual planning process was about 16 months. So it gave me a little PTSD to hear that. But nevertheless, there is, there's a frontier in terms of, the innovations, even in the automation space. And as you said, scenario production is some of them. Again, there's so much, Control C, Control V, Control X, Control V that can be automated through RPA. And gosh, we should do all of that, because that certainly isn't the highest and best use of our, colleagues' time. But we also see, more quote unquote AI or machine learning embedding itself into these systems, and that's incredibly interesting and powerful. Deep learning particularly, but the fun thing as someone who's studied AI and its impact for quite some time, and again, you download hundreds of pages from McKinsey.com. Some of the things that would just seem like they would be in the lab forever, really now are starting to have business impact. If you think about things like reinforcement learning, this idea you can have a machine sort of compete against another system to try to get to a better result. For a long time, the published papers, they were really intriguing, but they were all about video games, whether it's playing Go or playing these multiplayer games and all those sorts of things. But now we're starting to see reinforcement learning used for business processes. We have a YouTube video about some of my colleagues helping the America's Cup, Emirates New Zealand team use reinforcement learning both to design the foils that those boats fly on, as well as race strategy. And there were these cases where the Kiwi sailors had their own AlphaGo moment where they got beaten by the darn sailing agent, and just how challenging that is to somebody. But again, if you're designing foils for America's Cup, that is a use case around R&D, which plays out over and over again. How do you optimize thermal performance along with, the consumer attractiveness of a piece of consumer electronics? All of those things now are coming to the fore. You have these, large language models, which in some ways are, remarkably evocative. You can ask them questions and they appear to understand you.
Yeah.
Again, there are challenges around those as well, but nevertheless, you start to think, can we create customer experiences which are more engaging, which are easier to use, and all those sorts of things. But you have to manage a set of risks with those as well. And so you do see this frontier in terms of what's possible with the technology. And to a certain extent, one version of beyond automation is beyond today's automation technology to tomorrow's automation technology. And I think that's going to continue. But there are other aspects too.
There are so many the ways that we could unpack the things you've just been saying. Let me explore one to begin with, which is that I think you've touched on something that's been observed ever since Joe Weizenbaum wrote the ELIZA program that ran on an Apple II, where people imputed understanding to the machine when really it was only following a very small set of automatable behaviors. And because it does many things in a way that seems smart, we forget how little it actually understands, and we will overestimate its readiness not to do a stupid thing. And I think that is one of the areas where getting beyond automation means recognizing the need for a person in the loop to be able to direct and contain that. Someone said it's not so much that we're going to program machines anymore, we will be training them. But the difference between programming something and training it is that when you're training it, you're constantly aware at the edges of when it might be kind of going off the rails. And you will have the need to curate some training data to bring an ML back into a normal range instead of going HAL 9000 psychotic on us. And it's funny how long we've had these literary and fictional images of what can happen when it seems smart and we start to think it is like us, and it's really not.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. And by the way, I mean, I love this idea that, the term is machine learning, but it's really machine training, right? And
yes,
people don't realize that, right?
Yeah.
You don't send off, C3PO, it comes back and actually, you have to very intentionally choose
call it
the
a training data set.
Indeed, exactly.
And that is the thing. Now, among the other things you've suggested is that we really need to be looking on this at least three levels, because there's the distinction between automation and what, for example, IBM has called autonomic systems, automation, that are systems designed to deal with noise and error and have some degree of resilience. That's one thing. That's at the machine level, the technology level. There's the question of what this means for the individual worker. Do I regard this machine or technology as competing for my job or as a power tool to help me do my job? But then you've also pointed out that we need to be thinking of this at an organizational level, because what augments the power of the middle manager is seen as a threatening replacement by the frontline worker. And we need to have human conversations about this and not engineering conversations about this if we expect to achieve adoption, because without adoption, there's no value.
I absolutely agree. And let's take some of those just to explore them. Certainly at the level of the individual worker, there are the questions about how can the individual worker feel empowered by the technology. But the other thing that I'd note is, if you go back to that point we discussed earlier, which is in general, for all of us in our occupations, whatever they be, more and more technology is going to embed itself into the activities we do day to day. And in some cases, it will embed it to the degree to which someone actually has to change jobs. We did a podcast recently with David Otter, who said, the American jobs plan is go get a new job, right? So there's a little bit of that going on. But the other thing that I'd note, we did just sort of back of the envelope looking at in any large metropolitan area in the United States, how much is invested in K through 12. And by the way, let me just pause. I am not saying we should disinvest from our children's education, right? But hopefully we can make that better. But nevertheless, there's that investment. And then if you take a look at the investment in human capital or training across the rest of everybody's life,
yes,
the decades where we work,
yes.
And oftentimes, depending on how you count that, it's hard to get all the corporate training statistics. that ratio can be 60 to 1.
I wouldn't doubt it. Yeah.
Just massive. And if the findings from this research are that we're all going to have to change what we do and change our skills, beyond what we graduate with at whatever level, then how can we, I mean, I've described it as one of the grand challenges for the next few decades.
Yes.
How can we continually be able to skill up, this wide swath of workers to be able to take advantage of these automation and augmentation technologies going forward in the fullest way? And so I think that's just a grand challenge out there, public sector, private sector, social sector.
You're plucking a string that always makes me want to sing, Michael, because the word technology is so interesting. If you think about the fact that it's got ology at the end, because if you see a pile of rocks, you don't say, hey, look at that geology. And if you go through a forest, you don't say you've been visiting the biology. And yet we look at an object, a transistor or a piece of steel or whatever, and say, wow, that's technology. No, it's really not. Ology implies a study and a discipline and a crafting of a culture that can formulate its knowledge and share it to create new value for more people. And we think of technology as the outputs instead of as what it really is, which is the process that led to those outputs. And that's what we need to be studying. And to your point, making it relevant to working years now that will be many decades, instead of graduate from school and amortize the capital investment of your diploma. That now it's just a flawed model. Now, when you talk this way, it makes me think that you don't feel that we're on a breakneck pace of rapid change here, but that if anything, we're not deploying technology quickly enough to deal with the environment that we're going to be in, that we are already in by many measures.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of my concerns. I do think I sometimes have used this phrase, fast and micro, slow and macro. That in fact, an individual company, an individual work site can actually move quite quickly. But when you look across the entire economy, I mean, one of the things that we've discovered is that in the largest economies in the world in the past half century, 50 years or so, half of the economic growth that we've had has been underpinned by more people working, right? So populations have been increasing. We have more women in the workforce. People are healthier. They live longer. So more hours in the economy. And then productivity, some of it underpinned by technology, has driven the other half of economic growth that we have. Well, is the Japanese workforce growing or shrinking? Right, it's shrinking.
And the Chinese workforce actually also for some years now.
Western Europe, North America, because of aging.
And if you take the immigration component out of the U.S. economy, you would not be seeing what you see. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so simply in terms of hours worked, we're about to lose half of the sources of our economic growth in the next half century that we had in the past half century. And what that means is, in order for our children to continue to have appreciably better lives than we do, we need to accelerate productivity growth. And so we need these technologies. And by the way, there's this thing called the Solow paradox from back in the 80s. So some folks will remember it. Bob Solow is an economist.
Solow, Solow,
right. And he said, look, we see the computer age, because that's when we started to see the majority of capital spend be in IT everywhere except in productivity.
Yes.
And what happened was, about a decade later, we did see the acceleration in productivity, and he was nice enough to do some work with MGI here. And what the theory is, you need not just the technology, but the corresponding and complementary management innovation within organizations in order to fully take advantage of that technology. And so, to a certain extent, if we just apply RPA, as you were suggesting at the beginning, to doing automate sort of the annoying stuff in our work, but don't fundamentally change the way we do business, right? Apply the complementary management innovations to the technology, we're not going to get as much as we could. And we do see this. We see companies saying, oh, I put 1,000 bots in and I'm not getting as much out as I expected.
Yeah. There's diminishing returns, and there's also an extent to which we've harvested the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, over the last 10 or 20 years. You've talked about human capital. Booth School of Chicago put out a wonderful paper observing that it was the essentially zero cost of capital during the decade after the financial crisis that allowed enormous purchasing of technology in the sense of robotic automation, because you could finance it for practically nothing. And so you could get some unsustainable trends that now we are challenged. And as you've made clear, we're challenged at the level of thinking about how we design the systems, how we make them augmenters of people rather than bad replacements for people, and understand the need to architect organizations to use this effectively. And in that way, we will in fact be going beyond automation in every way. And that is the theme of our Forum conference this year. And Michael, it's been so great to have you illuminate these things with the rigor and the vigor that McKinsey always brings to these conversations. I'm Peter Coffey with Salesforce, and I've been joined by Michael Chui, a partner at McKinsey & Company and McKinsey Global Institute. And this has been part of the warm-up for this year's Forum 2022 for the Philadelphia Alliance for Capital and Technologies. Michael, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Peter. It's been a pleasure.